When I handed the property manager my $2,500 security deposit check 2 years ago, he smiled and said deposits were always returned to good tenants. When I moved out and he sent me a bill for $3,200 in damages instead, that same smile told me everything I needed to know. He'd done this before. Welcome to Cheating Story Exposed. Real stories, real justice, no sugarcoating. You know what? I notice many of you watching haven't hit that subscribe button yet. Here's the thing, we drop stories like this every single day. Stories about people who got played, got smart, and got even. If you want to see how these situations really end, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. My name is Vincent, and I'm a data analyst for a tech company. I've spent my career building systems that track patterns and anomalies. I'm methodical, I document everything, and I don't make accusations without evidence. These traits served me well in my career. I had no idea they'd serve me even better in small claims court. 2 years ago, I moved into a garden-style apartment complex called Riverside Terrace in the suburbs. It wasn't luxury, but it was clean, well-maintained, and affordable. The property manager, a guy named Glenn Pritchard, ran the place for a corporate ownership group based 3 states away. Glenn was in his late 40s, always wore polo shirts with the Riverside logo, and had that overly friendly salesman energy that felt slightly off. During my lease signing, Glenn made a big show of how fair and reasonable he was. He walked me through the move-in inspection form personally, pointing out every minor scratch and scuff. He even took photos himself with a timestamp camera, saying he wanted everything documented so there'd be no confusion when I moved out. I should have recognized that as a red flag, but I was focused on my new job and just wanted to get settled. I signed the lease, handed over my first month's rent and the $2,500 security deposit and moved in the next week. For 2 years, I was what anyone would call a model tenant. I paid rent 5 days early every month through automatic withdrawal. I never called maintenance for anything I could fix myself. I kept the place spotless. I didn't have parties, didn't own pets, and barely cooked because I worked long hours. The few times I did need maintenance, a dripping faucet, a bathroom light fixture that went out, I submitted requests through the online portal. They were handled within a week, no issues. Glenn would sometimes mention in passing that I was one of his easiest tenants. About 18 months into my lease, I started noticing something odd. 2 different neighbors mentioned in casual conversation that they'd lost their security deposits when they moved out. One couple, Ahmed and Lisa, had lived 3 doors down before moving to a house they'd purchased. Ahmed told me Glenn had kept their entire $2,200 deposit, claiming carpet replacement and wall repainting. The weird part? Ahmed said their apartment had been in pristine condition. They'd professionally cleaned the carpets themselves and hadn't even hung pictures on the walls because they were saving for their down payment. I asked what Glenn's itemized list had said. Ahmed pulled out his phone and showed me. The charges were vague: $300 for carpet deep cleaning and odor removal, $800 for full interior repainting, $400 for blind replacement, assorted smaller charges for things like cabinet hardware and outlet covers. Ahmed had been frustrated, but let it go. He said fighting over $2,200 wasn't worth the stress when they were focused on their new house. They'd left reviews on apartment rating sites, but those had apparently been taken down after Glenn complained to the platforms. I filed this information away. It bothered me, but I wasn't planning to move anytime soon. Then my company offered me a significant promotion that required relocating to their headquarters 2 states over. It was a career opportunity I couldn't pass up. I gave Glenn the required 60-day notice exactly as my lease specified. Here's where my data analyst instincts kicked in. Remembering what Ahmed and Lisa had experienced, I decided to document everything about my move-out process. I started with photographs, not just casual phone pics, but systematic documentation. I bought a timestamp camera app that embedded the date, time, and GPS coordinates into each image. Over 2 weeks, I photographed every surface, every wall, every corner of that apartment from multiple angles. I documented the carpets, which showed normal wear but no stains or damage. I photographed every wall, which had the same paint they'd had when I moved in. I knew because I'd kept my original move-in inspection form with Glenn's photos attached. I photographed cabinet interiors, light fixtures, window blinds, bathroom caulking, kitchen appliances, everything. I created a spreadsheet cross-referencing my move-in photos with my current photos. The apartment looked almost identical, minus 2 years of minor where that's considered normal. I also kept meticulous records of every maintenance request I'd submitted, along with the completion notices. This proved that any maintenance issues had been addressed during my tenancy and weren't my responsibility. 3 weeks before my move-out date, I requested a pre-inspection with Glenn so we could walk through together and identify any concerns. The lease didn't require this, but I wanted everything on record. Glenn agreed and we scheduled it for a Wednesday afternoon. The pre-inspection went smoothly. Glenn walked through with his tablet, occasionally making notes. When I asked if he saw any issues, he said everything looked fine. Normal wear and tear, nothing concerning. He specifically commented that the place was in better shape than most apartments after 2 years. I recorded this walkthrough on my phone, which was legally allowed in our state as long as one party consents, and I was that party. I kept my phone casually at my side, but the audio captured everything clearly. Glenn: "Yeah, Vincent, you've really taken care of the place. Honestly, you'll get most if not all of your deposit back. I might have to charge a standard cleaning fee, maybe $50, but that's typical." Me: "The walls look okay. I know that paint shows wear after a couple years." Glenn: "Nah, these are fine. We don't repaint unless there's damage or if it's been 5+ years. You're good." Me: "And the carpets?" Glenn: "They're fine, normal wear. We'd only replace these if there were stains or if they failed the condition inspection." This audio would prove critical later. I moved out on schedule. I spent 2 full days cleaning that apartment beyond what any normal person would consider necessary. I hired professional carpet cleaners and kept their receipt. I scrubbed every surface. I even cleaned inside the oven, which I'd barely used. On my final day, I did one more complete photo session. Then I submitted my forwarding address through the portal and dropped off my keys in the secure drop box, as instructed for after-hours returns. The lease specified that security deposit returns or itemized deduction lists would be sent within 30 days, as required by state law. 28 days later, I received an envelope from Riverside Terrace Management. Inside was not a check. It was an itemized bill claiming I owed them an additional $700 beyond my $2,500 deposit. I sat in my new apartment, staring at this document in disbelief. The charges were absurd: carpet replacement for entire unit, 400 interior repainting all rooms, 980 blind replacement living room and bedroom, 420 cabinet hardware replacement, 180 deep cleaning, 220 minor drywall repairs, 280 outlet cover replacement, 45 light fixture cleaning, 75 refrigerator shelf replacement, 100 total. 700 less my $2,500. Deposit: I supposedly owed $1,200, though Glenn had generously reduced this to $700 as a courtesy. Every single charge was either fabricated or wildly inflated. The carpets didn't need replacement. I had professional cleaning receipts and hundreds of photos proving they were in good condition. The walls didn't need repainting beyond normal touch-ups. The blinds were undamaged. The cabinet hardware was original and intact. The outlet covers, light fixtures, and refrigerator were all fine. This wasn't an honest dispute about condition standards. This was systematic fraud. I called Glenn immediately. He was friendly but firm. Glenn: "Hey Vincent, yeah, I know the bill seems high, but once we got in there after you left, we found a lot of issues. The carpets had odors we couldn't get out, the walls had scuffs that needed full repaints, stuff like that." Me: "Glenn, we did a walkthrough 3 weeks before I moved out. You said everything was fine." Glenn: "That was a preliminary look. The full inspection happened after you vacated. That's when we really assess everything." Me: "I have photos from my move-out day. I have professional carpet cleaning receipts. The place was spotless." Glenn: "Look, I'm just following our corporate standards. These charges are what they are. If you want to dispute them, you'd need to take it up with our legal team, but honestly, Vincent, that's not worth your time over a few $100. A few $100. He actually said that. Me: "You're saying I owe you $700 on top of losing my entire $2,500 deposit for an apartment I left in perfect condition." Glenn: "I'm saying our assessment shows these charges are legitimate. We have our own documentation. You can pay the $700 or we can send it to collections. Your choice." Then he added something that made my blood run cold. "Glenn, between you and me, Vincent, you should just pay it and move on. You don't want collections on your credit report. That affects everything, car loans, mortgages, job applications, not worth fighting over this. It was a threat. A veiled one but clear as day. Pay up or we'll damage your credit and your professional reputation. I asked for copies of his documentation, the photos and assessments justifying these charges. He said he'd email them. He never did. Over the next week, I sent 3 follow-up emails requesting the documentation. No response. I called twice. Both times I got voicemail and he didn't call back. That's when I decided to really dig in. I started by researching tenant rights in my state. I learned that state law required landlords to provide itemized deposit deductions within 30 days, which Glenn had technically done. However, the law also specified that charges had to be for actual damages beyond normal wear and tear, and they had to be reasonable and documented. More importantly, I discovered that the state had a consumer protection statute that allowed for treble damages, triple the amount, if a landlord was found to have acted in bad faith by wrongfully withholding a deposit, triple damages. That meant if I won, I wouldn't just get my $2,500 back. I could get $7,500. I also learned that small claims court in my state handled disputes up to $10,000, and attorney representation was optional. I could represent myself. Next, I started building my case file. I created a master binder with tabs. Move-in documentation, lease agreement, payment records, maintenance request history, pre-inspection walkthrough notes, and audio transcript move-out photographs. Printed in color, chronologically organized. Professional carpet cleaning receipt, Glenn's itemized deduction list. My email correspondence requesting documentation screenshots, showing he'd never provided his documentation. Then I created a comparison exhibit. Side-by-side photos of each room at move-in versus move-out. The rooms looked nearly identical, but I didn't stop there, remembering what Ahmed and Lisa had told me. I wondered if Glenn had done this to other tenants. I started searching online for reviews of Riverside Terrace. Most platforms had taken down negative reviews, but I found cached versions and screenshots people had posted on tenant advocacy forums. Multiple former tenants described the exact same pattern. Friendly property manager during the lease pre-inspection goes fine after move-out. Entire deposit kept with inflated or fake charges. No documentation provided despite requests. Threats about collections if disputed. I found 7 different tenants who described this experience with Glenn over the past 3 years. This wasn't isolated. It was a system. I tracked down 3 of these former tenants through social media and mutual connections. I explained what had happened to me and asked if they'd be willing to provide written statements or appear as witnesses if needed. 2 agreed immediately. The third, a woman named Patricia, said she'd actually kept all her documentation because she'd considered suing but ultimately hadn't due to time constraints and stress. She offered to share everything with me. Patricia sent me her files. Her situation was nearly identical to mine. Spotless apartment, fabricated damage claims, $2,300 deposit kept. She even had her own recording of a pre-inspection where Glenn had said everything looked great. Now I had a pattern evidence. I filed my small claims complaint exactly 37 days after receiving Glenn's deduction letter. I filed not just for return of my $2,500 deposit, but for $7,500 under the treble damages statute, plus my filing fees and costs. Glenn and Riverside Terrace management were served with the complaint 2 weeks later. 3 days after service, I got a call from Glenn. His tone had changed. Glenn: Vincent, hey, I got this court summons. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Let's work this out. Me: I tried to work it out. You threatened to send me to collections. Glenn: I never threatened you, man. Look, maybe I was a bit harsh. Tell you what, I'll send you back your $2,500. We'll call it even. You dropped the suit. Me: you also claimed I owed you $700. Glenn: we'll forget that. Fresh start. You get your full deposit back. We both move on. Me: that doesn't address the bad faith withholding. Glenn: bad faith? Come on, Vincent. This is a disagreement about condition standards. Happens all the time. Don't make this into something it's not. Me: did you provide me with your documentation when I requested it? Silence. Glenn: I'll have that sent over. Me: 3 weeks ago I asked for it. You ignored me. That's bad faith. Glenn: look, I'm offering you your money back. That's fair. Me: see you in court, Glenn. I hung up. 10 minutes later, my bank app showed a direct deposit of $2,500 from Riverside Terrace Management. Glenn had returned my deposit, but only after I sued. This actually strengthened my case because it showed he'd known his charges were false all along. The court date was set for 6 weeks later. During that time, Glenn tried twice more to get me to drop the suit. Once through email, once through a voicemail. Both times he emphasized that I'd already gotten my deposit back, so there was nothing left to fight about. He didn't understand. This wasn't about $2,500 anymore. This was about accountability. I spent those 6 weeks refining my presentation. I created a timeline poster board showing the sequence of events. I prepared clean copies of every document. I organized my evidence binder with color-coded tabs and an index. I practiced my opening statement and anticipated questions. I also subpoenaed records from Riverside Terrace showing their carpet replacement and painting costs over the past year. When those records arrived, they were damning. For the 8 units they'd actually replaced carpets in, the average cost was $620, not the $1,400 they'd charged me. For the units they'd painted, the average was $380 for full interior painting, not $980. Glenn had inflated his charges by more than double. I also subpoenaed the lease files for Ahmed, Patricia, and 2 other former tenants who'd agreed to be witnesses. Each file showed the same pattern: good payment history, minimal maintenance requests, then massive deposit deductions after move-out. 3 days before the hearing, something interesting happened. A woman named Diane Harper called me. She introduced herself as the regional property director for the corporate ownership group that owned Riverside Terrace and 12 other properties. Glenn reported to her, "Yan, Mr. Reeves, I received notification that you're pursuing litigation against our property and Glenn Pritchard. I wanted to reach out personally." Me, "I appreciate that, Ms. Harper." Diane, "I've reviewed your complaint and some of the documentation. I have to say, I'm concerned about the characterizations being made." Glenn is a valued employee with 8 years of excellent service. Me, "Have you reviewed the pattern of similar complaints from other tenants?" Pause, Deanne, "I'm not aware of any pattern. Could you elaborate?" I told her about Ahmed, Patricia, and the others. I mentioned the cached reviews and the forum posts. I explained that I had witnesses and documentation. Another pause, longer this time. Deanne, "Mr. Reeves, would you be amenable to settling this matter? We could offer compensation beyond your return deposit as a gesture of goodwill." Me, "How much?" Deanne, "An additional $1,500, total $4,000. In exchange, you'd sign a non-disparagement agreement and drop the suit." Me, "So you'd pay me $4,000 to be quiet about the fact that Glenn has been systematically defrauding tenants." Diane, "That's not what I said." Me, "But it's what you meant." Ms. Harper, if you're calling to settle, that tells me you've reviewed the evidence and you know Glenn's been running a scam. If that's true, why would I settle for $4,000 when the court could award $7,500 plus costs? Deanne, "Litigation is uncertain, Mr. Reeves. There's no guarantee." Me, "I have timestamped photos, audio recordings, multiple witnesses, documentation that Glenn inflated costs and made up charges, and now I have your settlement offer which shows you know he's guilty. See you in court, Ms. Harper." I hung up. My hand was shaking slightly, but I felt good. The day of the hearing arrived. Small Claims Court was in a modest courthouse building downtown. The hearing room was less formal than a regular courtroom, more like a conference room with a judge's bench. I arrived 30 minutes early with my evidence binder, poster board, and a box of documents. I wore a suit. I wanted to look professional and credible. Glenn showed up 15 minutes before our scheduled time, looking nervous. He was wearing khakis and a wrinkled button-down shirt. No lawyer with him. What I didn't expect was Diane Harper sitting in the gallery. She was there to observe. Our case was third on the docket. I watched the first 2 proceedings to get a feel for how Judge Martha Kowalski ran her courtroom. She was direct, no nonsense, and clearly impatient with unprepared parties. She asked pointed questions and cut off rambling. I appreciated that. When our case was called, we both approached the plaintiff and defendant tables. Judge Kowalski reviewed the file briefly, then looked up. "Judge, Mr. Reeves, you're seeking $7,500 in treble damages under the Consumer Protection Statute, claiming bad faith withholding of your security deposit. Mr. Pritchard, you're representing yourself and Riverside Terrace Management." Glenn, "Yes, Your Honor." Judge, "Mr. Reeves, this is your claim. Present your case." I took a breath and began, me. Your Honor, I was a tenant at Riverside Terrace for 2 years. During that time, I paid rent on time every month, maintained the apartment in excellent condition, and was by all accounts a model tenant. When I provided 60 days' notice and moved out, the defendant withheld my entire $2,500 security deposit and claimed I owed an additional $700 for fabricated damages. I walked through the timeline using my poster board. I explained the pre-inspection where Glenn had said everything was fine, and I played the audio recording. Judge Kowalski listened carefully. I showed the comparison photos, move-in versus move-out. I presented my professional carpet cleaning receipt. I showed Glenn's itemized deduction list with wildly inflated charges. Then I showed the subpoenaed records proving what carpet replacement and painting actually cost, demonstrating that Glenn had charged me double. Judge Kowalski asked her first question. Judge, Mr. Reeves, the defendant returned your deposit before this hearing. Doesn't that resolve your claim? Me, no, Your Honor. He only returned it after I filed suit. For 37 days, he wrongfully withheld it while claiming I actually owed him more money. He threatened to send me to collections if I didn't pay an additional $700. He refused to provide documentation when I requested it multiple times. These actions show bad faith, which is why I'm seeking treble damages under the Consumer Protection Statute. Judge, what documentation did you request? Me. I asked for photos and documentation justifying his damage claims. I sent 3 emails and left 2 voicemails. He never responded until after he was served with this lawsuit. I showed printouts of those unanswered emails. Judge Kowalski turned to Glenn. Judge, Mr. Pritchard, why didn't you respond to Mr. Reeves's requests for documentation? Glenn, Your Honor, we have documentation. I was busy with other properties and, Judge, did you have the documentation when Mr. Reeves requested it? Glenn, we had inspection notes, yes. Judge, then why not send them? Glenn, I honestly don't have a good answer for that, Your Honor. It was an oversight. Judge, an oversight that lasted 3 weeks and multiple requests. Glenn shifted uncomfortably. Glenn, I believed our charges were legitimate. Mr. Reeves could have come to the office to review the file. Judge, did you tell him that? Glenn, no. Judge, did you offer that option in any of your communications? Glenn, no. Judge Kowalski made a note, then looked back at me. Judge, Mr. Reeves, you mentioned a pattern. Explain that. This was my moment. Me, Your Honor, I discovered that the defendant has used this same scheme on multiple tenants. I have 3 former tenants prepared to testify, and documentation from 4 others showing identical patterns, unjustified deposit withholding with inflated charges. Judge, these witnesses are here? Me, yes, Your Honor. I'd arranged for Ahmed, Patricia, and another former tenant named Marcus to attend. All 3 stood when I gestured to them. Judge Kowalski called them forward one at a time. Each testified briefly about their experiences. Each described the same pattern. Patricia even had her own recording of Glenn saying her apartment looked fine, followed by $2,300 in bogus charges. Glenn's face got progressively paler as each witness spoke. When Marcus finished testifying, Judge Kowalski addressed Glenn directly. Judge, Mr. Pritchard, I'm seeing a clear pattern here. Do you dispute these testimonies? Glenn, Your Honor, each situation is different. Apartment condition is somewhat subjective. Judge, carpet replacement costs aren't subjective. Mr. Reeves presented your own company records showing you charged him $1,400 for carpets that cost $620. How is that legitimate? Glenn, the charge includes labor and administrative costs. Judge, show me documentation of those additional costs. Glenn, I don't have that with me. Judge, did you have it when you sent Mr. Reeves his deduction letter? Glenn, we use standard cost schedules. Judge, standard schedules that are more than double your actual costs, that's not a standard, Mr. Pritchard, that's fraud. The word hung in the air. Glenn looked like he wanted to disappear. Judge, here's what I see. A property manager who systematically overcharges tenants, withholds deposits based on fabricated or grossly inflated damages, refuses to provide documentation when requested, and only returns deposits when sued. This is precisely the kind of bad faith conduct the Consumer Protection Statute was designed to address. She turned to me. Judge, Mr. Reeves, your documentation is thorough and compelling. You've proven your case clearly. I'm finding in your favor. My heart hammered. Judge, judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $7,500, representing treble damages under the Consumer Protection Statute. The defendant is also responsible for the plaintiff's filing fees and costs. Additionally, I'm recommending this case be forwarded to the State Consumer Protection Division for investigation. Glenn's face went white. Glenn, Your Honor, I'd like to request. Judge, Mr. Pritchard, you had every opportunity to resolve this appropriately. You chose instead to engage in deceptive practices. Judgment is entered. This hearing is concluded. She banged her gavel. I gathered my materials, still processing what had just happened. I'd won. Not just won, I'd won decisively, with the judge calling out Glenn's conduct explicitly. As I walked toward the exit, Diane Harper intercepted me in the hallway. Diane, Mr. Reeves, that was quite a presentation. Me, thank you, Diane. I need to ask you something directly. Do you have documentation of other instances beyond the 3 witnesses who testified? Me, I have records of 7 other former tenants describing identical experiences. Diane's expression hardened. Diane, can you send those to me? Me, why? Diane, because if what you're saying is true, if Glenn has been systematically doing this, then we have a serious problem. Our company didn't know. We trusted him to manage these properties. Ethically, I studied her face. She seemed genuinely shocked. Me, I'll send you everything I have, but I meant what I said. This was systematic. Glenn's been running this scam for years. Diane, if that's true, he won't be managing anything for us after today. She left. I watched her go, then saw Glenn exit the courtroom looking shaken. He saw me and actually changed direction to avoid walking past me. I went home feeling lighter than I had in months. The judgment was official within 2 weeks. Glenn had to pay me $7,500 plus $347 in court costs and filing fees. Total, $7,847. The money arrived via certified check 30 days later, the maximum time allowed. I knew Glenn had dragged his feet right up until the last possible moment. But the money wasn't the real story. 4 days after the hearing, I received an email from Diane Harper. The subject line read, Riverside Terrace Management Changes. The email was professional but direct. Diane informed me that Riverside Terrace Management had conducted an internal investigation following the court hearing. They'd reviewed Glenn's files for the past 3 years, interviewed former tenants, and examined security deposit handling procedures. What they found confirmed everything I'd presented in court. Glenn had withheld full or partial security deposits from 41 tenants over 3 years. The total amount wrongfully kept was approximately $87,000. Most charges were either fabricated or inflated by 150–300% over actual costs. Diane wrote that Glenn had been terminated immediately. She also mentioned that the corporate ownership group was implementing new policies. All security deposit deductions would require photographic documentation reviewed by corporate before being sent to tenants, and a third-party audit would review all past deposit withholdings. She ended by thanking me for bringing this to their attention, though I suspected that gratitude was mixed with concern about potential liability. Following week, I received a Facebook message from Ahmed, my former neighbor who'd lost his $2,200 deposit. Ahmed, Vincent, I don't know what you did, but I just got a check from Riverside Terrace for $2,200 and an apology letter. Did you have something to do with this? I smiled as I typed my response. Me, let's just say someone finally looked at Glenn's records. Glad you got your money back. Ahmed, man, Lisa and I had written that money off. We figured it was gone. This is incredible. Thank you. Over the next 2 weeks, I heard from Patricia and 3 other former tenants. All of them had received refund checks for their wrongfully withheld deposits. The corporate office was apparently working through Glenn's entire history and making restitution. I calculated that my lawsuit had resulted in roughly $87,000 being returned to tenants who'd been scammed. That felt better than any judgment amount. A month after the hearing, I got an unexpected call from a reporter at the local newspaper in the city where Riverside Terrace was located. Someone had tipped them off about the story. I suspected it was one of the other tenants, and they wanted to write an article about tenant rights and security deposit fraud. I agreed to an interview. The article ran 2 weeks later under the headline, Former Tenant's Lawsuit Uncovers Years of Security Deposit Fraud at Local Apartment Complex. The article detailed Glenn's scheme, my lawsuit, and the corporate investigation that followed. It mentioned that 41 tenants had been affected and that the property management company had made restitution. The article also quoted Judge Kowalski, who'd agreed to speak on the record about the case. She'd said, This case demonstrates why we have consumer protection statutes. When businesses engage in systematic fraud, individual victims often don't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. Mr. Reeves did his homework, built a solid case, and held a bad actor accountable. That's how the system is supposed to work. I kept a copy of that article. The real surprise came 3 months later. I received a letter from the State Consumer Protection Division. They'd opened a formal investigation into Glenn Pritchard's practices based on Judge Kowalski's recommendation and the evidence I'd provided. They were pursuing administrative penalties against Glenn personally, including potential fines and a prohibition from working in property management in the state. The letter asked if I'd be willing to cooperate with their investigation. I called the investigator the next day and spent 2 hours walking her through everything. I shared all my documentation, witness contacts, and records. She told me they were building a strong case. 6 months after my court hearing, the state issued its findings. Glenn Pritchard was fined $15,000 and permanently barred from holding a property management license in the state. The administrative order cited systematic fraudulent practices, bad faith dealings with consumers, and willful violations of landlord-tenant law. Glenn would never manage another property in our state. I learned through social media that Glenn had moved to another state and was apparently working in car sales now. Some mutual connections said he'd tried to get property management positions, but couldn't due to the state prohibition and the public records of the lawsuit and administrative action. His career in property management was over. As for me, the $7,847 went into my savings account. I didn't need it immediately. My new job paid well, but it represented something more important than money. It represented the principle that fraud has consequences. I thought a lot about what made the difference in my case. Many tenants in similar situations just walk away. They don't have the time, energy, or knowledge to fight. They accept the loss and move on. I had advantages. I'm detail-oriented by nature and profession. I understood how to build a case systematically. I had the time to research tenant law and court procedures. I was willing to invest hours into documentation and preparation. But more than that, I was angry enough to see it through. Not explosive anger, calculated anger. The kind that says, "You're not getting away with this." Glenn had made a critical mistake. He'd assumed I was like his other victims, that I'd complain, maybe leave a bad review, but ultimately accept the loss because fighting seemed too hard. He didn't count on someone who treats problems like data puzzles. Someone who believes that if you have the facts on your side and present them clearly, justice will follow. I was lucky too. I had a judge who took the case seriously and recognized the pattern. I had witnesses willing to testify. I had documentation that was nearly airtight, but luck favors preparation. I created the conditions for luck to work in my favor. The experience taught me something valuable about institutional fraud. It thrives on two things: victims who don't know their rights and victims who know their rights but feel too overwhelmed to enforce them. Glenn's scheme worked for years because most people fell into one of those categories. Even the ones who were savvy enough to recognize the fraud often decided that fighting over $2,000 or $3,000 wasn't worth the stress. That's what he counted on. The math of intimidation. Make the process of fighting back seem more costly than the money being stolen. But that math changes when you document everything, research the law, find other victims, and refuse to be intimidated. Suddenly the fraudster is exposed, the pattern becomes obvious, and the system works the way it's supposed to. I sometimes wonder how much money Glenn stole over his entire career, not just the 3 years I investigated. If he'd been doing this at multiple properties for 8 years, the number could be in the hundreds of thousands. I also think about the tenants who never got their money back, the ones from before the investigation, the ones who'd moved away and couldn't be traced, the ones who'd already spent the money they should have gotten back. That bothers me. Justice in my case was clean and complete, but justice for the broader situation was partial at best. Still, 41 families got their money back. Glenn lost his career. Future tenants at Riverside Terrace and the other properties under that corporate ownership group would be protected by new policies. The state prohibition meant Glenn couldn't scam tenants anymore, at least not in our state. That's not nothing. I kept the evidence binder on my bookshelf for about a year after the case concluded. Sometimes I'd flip through it, marveling at how something as simple as time-stamped photographs and organized records had been so powerful. Eventually, I scanned everything and put it in cloud storage, then donated the physical binder, but I kept the judge's written judgment. It's framed in my home office now, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that documentation matters, that preparation matters, that standing up to fraud, even when it's easier to walk away, matters, and a reminder that sometimes the system actually works if you make it work. My friends and colleagues know the broad strokes of the story. I've told it at dinner parties when conversation turns to bad landlord experiences. People always ask the same questions. Wasn't it stressful? Yes. Preparing for court while working a demanding new job was exhausting. But it was productive stress, the kind that comes from working toward a goal. Was it worth your time? Absolutely. Not just for the money, but for the principle and the outcome for other tenants. Would you do it again? Without hesitation. Actually advised 3 friends through similar situations since then. One was dealing with a contractor who'd taken a deposit and disappeared. Another was fighting a car dealership over fraudulent charges. The third was handling a dispute with a home warranty company. In each case, I gave them the same advice. Document everything, research your rights, be methodical, and don't be intimidated by their lawyers or their threats. 2 of them won their cases. The third settled favorably after showing they were serious about fighting. There's a certain satisfaction in watching someone apply these principles and succeed. It reinforces my belief that ordinary people can take on institutional fraud and win if they're willing to put in the work. My parents were proud when I told them about the case. My father, who's a retired engineer, appreciated the systematic approach. My mother, who taught elementary school for 30 years, appreciated that I'd stood up for other people who'd been victimized. My younger sister joked that I'd found my calling as a vigilante data analyst. I told her I was perfectly happy keeping data analysis as my day job and limiting my legal career to that one case. Though I'll admit, there was something deeply satisfying about standing in that courtroom and watching a con artist face consequences. The judge's words stuck with me. This is precisely the kind of bad faith conduct the Consumer Protection Statute was designed to address. Laws only matter if people enforce them. Courts only deliver justice if someone brings the case. Rights only exist if someone asserts them. Glenn's fraud continued for years because no one had pushed hard enough to expose it. Not because victims were lazy or stupid, but because fighting back seemed overwhelming. I just happened to have the skills, personality, and situation that made fighting back feel achievable rather than impossible. Looking back now, 2 years after the hearing, I can see the bigger picture. That $2,500 deposit wasn't really about the money. It was about respect, about being treated fairly, about not letting someone steal from me and get away with it. Glenn had calculated that I'd be like his other victims, frustrated but ultimately passive. He'd miscalculated badly, the best part. I know for a fact that Glenn thinks about me. Every time he has to explain to a potential employer why he can't work in property management anymore, he thinks about the tenant who built a case so thorough that it ended his career. Every time someone Googles his name and finds the newspaper article and court records, he thinks about me. Every time he considers trying something shady in his new career, there's probably a voice in his head that says, "What if this one's like Vincent?" That voice is my legacy from this case. A reminder in Glenn's head that not everyone will just roll over. I don't feel vindictive about it. I feel satisfied. There's a difference. Vindictive would be continuing to pursue him, trying to cause more damage, taking pleasure in his suffering. Satisfaction is knowing that justice was served, that a wrong was righted, and that the world is slightly fairer because I took action. I moved forward with my life. The promotion that had started this whole chain of events turned out to be excellent for my career. I've been promoted twice more since then. I'm doing work I love, making good money, and living in a city I enjoy. I rent an apartment. Yes, I'm still renting. The difference is that now I'm educated about tenant rights. I document everything from day one, and I research property management companies before signing leases. My current landlord is excellent. Repairs are handled within 24 hours. My security deposit is held in an escrow account I can verify. The lease is clear and fair. Funny how much you learn about good practices by encountering bad ones. Sometimes I think about alternate timelines. What if I'd just paid Glenn the $700 he demanded? What if I'd been too busy with my new job to pursue the case? What if I'd accepted his offer to return my deposit and drop the suit? In those timelines, Glenn is still managing Properties, he's still running his scam. Those 41 families never got their money back. Future tenants would continue to be victimized. But in this timeline, the actual one, Glenn's gone, policies changed. Money was returned. The system worked, all because I decided that $2,500 mattered enough to fight for. Actually, that's not quite right. It wasn't about the $2,500. It was about the principle that fraud should have consequences. That bullies shouldn't win just because fighting back is inconvenient. That documentation and preparation can beat intimidation and institutional advantage. Those principles mattered enough to fight for. The money was just how we kept score. I learned something important about myself through this experience. I'm not naturally confrontational. I don't seek out conflict. I'm generally pretty easygoing, but I have a line. And when someone crosses it through deliberate dishonesty and attempted theft, something in me shifts from easygoing to immovable. Glenn found that line. He stomped across it. And he learned that not everyone responds to intimidation the way he expected. That's my takeaway. Not that I'm some crusader for justice, but that I'm capable of standing up when it matters. That I can be strategic and patient when pursuing a goal. That I don't have to accept being victimized just because fighting back seems hard. Those are good things to know about yourself. I've told this story probably 50 times now, and people always want to know, what would you say to someone in a similar situation? My answer is always the same. First, document everything. Not just when problems arise, but from day one. Take timestamp photos, keep emails, save receipts, create a paper trail. Second, know your rights. Spend an hour researching tenant law in your state. Understand what's legal and what isn't. Most states have consumer protection agencies with free resources. Third, don't be intimidated. Landlords and property managers count on you being overwhelmed by the process. They'll use technical language and veiled threats. Don't let that stop you. Fourth, look for patterns. If it happened to you, it probably happened to others. Those others are potential witnesses and allies. Fifth, be systematic. Approach the case like a project. Create timelines, organize evidence, prepare exhibits. Make it easy for the judge to see the truth. Sixth, stay calm. Getting emotional in court helps no one. Present facts clearly and let the evidence speak. Seventh, follow through. Don't file the lawsuit unless you're committed to seeing it through to the end. And finally, sometimes it's worth fighting even when the amount seems small. Because it's not really about the amount. It's about living in a world where fraud has consequences. That's what I'd tell someone facing a similar situation. Of course, I'd also tell them that they need to evaluate their own circumstances. Not everyone has the time, energy, or resources to pursue a case like this. There's no shame in deciding that fighting isn't worth it for you personally. But for those who can fight and choose to fight, the tools are available. The system can work. Justice is possible. You just have to be willing to do the work. Glenn taught me that bullies fold when confronted with preparation and determination. Diane Harper taught me that corporations sometimes don't know what their employees are doing until someone forces them to look. Judge Kowalski taught me that judges appreciate thorough documentation and clear presentation, and I taught myself that I'm capable of more than I thought. That might be the most valuable lesson of all. 2 years later, I'm still in touch with Patricia and Ahmed. We've become friends in that way that people do when they've been through something together. We grab coffee occasionally when I'm back in that city for work. They both say the refunded deposits made real differences in their lives. For Ahmed and Lisa, it helped with furniture for their new house. For Patricia, it covered unexpected medical bills, money that should have been theirs all along but might have stayed stolen if not for the lawsuit. That feels good. I've also become something of a resource in my social circles for anyone dealing with tenant issues, contractor disputes, or consumer fraud. People know I successfully fought a case, so they ask for advice. I'm always happy to help. Knowledge is meant to be shared. The framed judgment still hangs in my office. Visitors occasionally ask about it. I give them the short version. Bad property manager, documented everything, won in court. The long version is what I've told you here. It's a story about $2,500 that became $7,500 that really wasn't about money at all. It's a story about a con artist who miscalculated his target. It's a story about how preparation beats intimidation. It's a story about how the system can work when someone makes it work. And it's a story about a data analyst who learned he could be pretty effective in a courtroom when armed with evidence and determination. Glenn Pritchard is somewhere out there selling cars now, forever barred from managing properties in our state. I imagine he tells himself that I got lucky, that the case was a fluke, that he was the victim of an overzealous tenant and an unfair system. But deep down, he knows the truth. He got caught because he got sloppy with the wrong person. Someone who documented everything. Someone who researched the law. Someone who found the other victims. Someone who refused to be intimidated. Someone who understood that sometimes the difference between justice and theft is just whether someone's willing to fight for it. I was willing to fight, and I won, not just in court, not just in the judgment amount, not just in ending Glenn's career. I won by proving to myself that standing up to fraud is possible. That ordinary people can take on institutional bad actors. That documentation and preparation matter. That the system, for all its flaws, sometimes delivers real justice. Those are victories worth more than any dollar amount. Though I'll admit, the $7,847 was pretty nice too. Looking back, I realized the most important moment wasn't the courtroom victory. It was the decision, sitting in my apartment staring at that fraudulent bill, to fight back instead of accepting the loss. Everything else flowed from that decision. Glenn had built his entire scam on the assumption that people wouldn't fight. That assumption worked 41 times. On the 42nd time, it didn't, because I made a different choice. That choice changed the outcome for dozens of people and ended a fraud scheme that had been running for years. One person armed with facts and determination made that difference. If you're facing something similar, remember that. Your choice matters. Your action matters. Justice is possible. You just have to be willing to document, prepare, and fight. The rest follows.